For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Did you know that 80 to 90% of the global transactions are denominated in the US dollar? Did you know that after Russia invaded Ukraine, the US and its allies weaponized the power of the dollar and froze the country's foreign currency reserves? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host Anil Padmanabhan. Last week, Uday Kotak, the outgoing chairman and CEO of Kotak Mahindra Bank, used uncharacteristically strong words to condemn the hegemony of the US dollar. He called it the world's biggest financial terrorist. He is not alone. President Lula of Brazil last month used similar words to condemn the hegemony of the US dollar. He did so during a bilateral visit to China, a country that has not only questioned the hegemony of the United States but also challenged the domination of the US dollar. And the larger fear underlying these outbursts is that this hegemony vests disproportionate power in the hands of the Americans if they chose to weaponize it, as it happened when they sanctioned Russia after they invaded Ukraine. Even as noises grow against the domination of the US dollar, incipient trends of de-dollarization are visible. The question is whether the world is willing to detox from the dollar, and if so, how will it pursue this task? To understand this and more, we spoke to Montek Singh Ahluwalia, the former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission and also one of India's most skillful technocrats. I began by drawing Montek's attention to the remarks of both Uday Kotak and President Lula.
Uday Kotak's remark did get a lot of attention, and as you said, President Lula said something similar. I think the issue of the dollar being such a dominant part of the global currency system, both in terms of reserves and in terms of involvement in currency transactions, has been something that people have been aware of and commented on quite a bit. I think what has made the current remarks maybe more relevant is the fear that the US might unilaterally want to weaponize the dollar by, enforcing sanctions, which it imposes unilaterally by essentially denying people access to a large part of the financial system. It's not just dollars. For example, the threat to close SWIFT, which is an essential part of banks transferring money to banks that you don't like. This has raised an issue that, is the global financial system run by accepted multilateral rules, or is it simply a unilateral action? Now, the point is that countries can take unilateral actions, but when the countries have a dominant position in what is in effect a global public good, then the ability to take unilateral actions gives too much power. And I think that's a legitimate issue. Now, how we're going to resolve it is a much more open issue. And I think in due course, I'm sure we'll come across suggestions in this regard.
Thanks, Chief. That's a great point you're making about how this hegemony can be weaponized. It's not can, it's actually been weaponized. So I just want to, for the benefit of our viewers, if you could tell them as to how the US has come to occupy such a preeminent position in the global financial world.
Well, at the start of the previous century, before the First World War, the US was not that dominant. The dominant currencies were really the pound and some of the other European currencies. The First World War and the Second World War pretty much decimated the economic position of the European countries and greatly strengthened the United States. And by the end of the Second World War, I mean, the US was the centerpiece of the global economy. It had a very large share of GDP. It also, other currencies had always relied on some kind of a dollar standard, which broke down in the interwar years. The United States was the only currency that guaranteed conversion into the dollar at whatever $31 for 1 troy ounce of gold. And that gave them a very, very special position. Now, the French in those days, in the 60s, challenged this position. I think General de Gaulle actually sent the French Navy after wanting to convert the French reserves into gold, shipped the gold across to Paris using the French Navy. And the moment he did that, it became clear that there were too many dollars, and there's no way that the US could have ensured the conversion of every dollar into gold at the fixed rate. And in 1971, Nixon sort of suspended that. I mean, initially, it was meant to be a temporary suspension, but of course, it became a permanent suspension. Currencies began to float with each other, and a whole new, what I would call, post-Bretton Woods system came into play. But, although it was a post-Bretton Woods system, the dominance of the dollar was not in question. Now, several reasons account for the dollar being so important. One is, of course, if oil pricing is being done in dollars, and everybody has to buy oil and have to pay in dollars, that gives a big boost, if you like, to the dollar as a transaction currency. But, in addition to that, as the currency markets opened up for non-trade transactions, the fact is that the US had the best and the most liquid market for financial assets. I mean, in the old days, if you wanted to, if a Mexican wanted to buy a Canadian dollar, it was cheaper to use the pesos to buy the US dollar and then use the US dollar to buy the Canadian dollar, because the market for just pesos to Canadian dollars was too thin and had too many inefficiencies built in. So over time, the dollar became the dominant currency.
Given the global domination of the US dollar, the United States can, if it so chooses, shut down the world.
Well, it would, of course, do enormous damage to the United States. But yes, I mean, if it is effectively in control of the dominant currency, the damage that it can inflict on the world is very large. The only constraint in the system would be that the US would not want to damage itself. And so it would act a little bit rationally. But, having said all that, I think it is relevant to ask, are there any multilateral rules by which the global currency system operates? I mean, for example, if you're a reserve currency and I'm holding my reserves in your currency, is there some understanding that you cannot interrupt me using my reserves? Or is that just left to your own sweet will? And that's really the concern.
And at this point, there are no multilateral rules governing currency transactions between countries, right? It's more like
I think not, actually, because I think this is clearly something which, I mean, ideally, the IMF is the relevant body that should pronounce on these matters, because it is the body that looks at currency issues. I'm not aware that there are, when the US does what it does, either by SWIFT. I mean, SWIFT is not based in the US, though clearly a US-dominated thing, is based in Belgium. But when the US and the Europeans sort of decide that they're going to cut off some banks from access to SWIFT, I'm not sure what rules apply or what rules they are applying. I mean, even in the case of the Russian bank, they left an exception for Gazprom Bank.
The obvious question is, if the world chooses to go down the path of dollar detox, what are the disruptions that this will entail?
Well, look, the rolling down or the transition doesn't necessarily have to be disruptive. I mean, what is a problem is a steady transition that is taking place, which it was in the share of reserves although not yet in the currency transaction share, that was taking place over the last 20 years quite seamlessly without any problems. Okay, where it becomes a problem is if it's suddenly picked up and something very disruptive is done and makes people suddenly realize that, listen, we are quite vulnerable. And that's what the various remarks of different people have pointed to. And they do reflect a genuine concern. Most people, however, think that, as long as there's nothing disruptive done, and mind you, if it's disruptive, it will have a lot of side effects, which are not just on the other countries, but also the US. The phasing out will take long. And the reason it will take long is that when it comes to developing alternative financial capital markets, that's very difficult to do. There are very strong network effects. After all, the US doesn't just have a currency market in its own currency. It deals with all sorts of currencies. So there are strong network effects which focus on a particular country or a particular financial center, where certain currencies become dominant, and over time, they're bound to change. But, they will change when the other countries that are rising also become open. Look, for example, sometimes I find people saying, oh, we should think of making the Indian rupee a reserve currency. It's a nice national objective, makes you feel good. But in order to make the Indian rupee into a reserve currency, we must argue to open the capital account completely, which really means that anybody with rupees in India, if they want to walk out, should be free to do so. And anybody with dollars elsewhere, if they want to come in and buy rupees, should be free to do so. Now, the moment you pose that as the other side of the coin of making the Indian rupee a reserve currency, you'll find a lot of people will have doubts. The US doesn't have any doubts on that. That's the really important thing.
What is also happening is that over time, in a relative sense, the economic clout of the US is diminishing. At the same time, the US continues to be the world's biggest and most dominant economy.
Also, over time, its share in reserves declined. In 2000, I think, the share was 71% of all reserves held in dollars, gone down to 58%. Now, the interesting thing is, it's not as if the decline has been offset by people holding more euros and more pounds, or that matter, more yen. They've actually been holding more of other currencies. In fact, 1/4, I'm told, of the decline in the US share went to bolster the renminbi, which went up from 2%, something a little more. And the rest actually went to other currencies. So the diversification of reserve holdings is taking place through a normal process as people realize that trade takes place among many different countries, and that we need many different currencies. But that's a gradual process, and it's still 58%. You know what? While it's 58%, if you take both trade transactions and financial transactions, then the dollar is on the other side of 88% of all transactions. Yes, there are new, you could have said, what about the euro? The euro came on board in 1999 or something like that. But, for the first several years, it wasn't a very certain instrument. Lots and lots of internal differences within Europe, even questions whether the euro could survive. Now, I think they fixed those problems by creating an internal sort of fiscal support to the common euro. But I think it's still not, it doesn't have the sort of sense of confidence that the US has. So it's unlikely that the euro will show much of an increase. Similarly for the renminbi. China is a very, very important country. But the point is, its market is not open. There's far too much uncertainty. in the absence of a market economy that people can walk in and walk out of at will, it's going to take a long time for the Chinese renminbi to actually threaten the dollar. But I think all said and done, the dominant position of the dollar is not the real problem. The real problem, I think, which is worrying people, is a unilateral interruption of access to financial transactions, either involving the dollar or through the established banking system. Could this disrupt economic activity? That's a very genuine problem.
Montek is right. Under the current circumstances, neither the euro nor the Chinese renminbi can replace the US dollar. Uday Kotak, in his outburst, had also made out a case for the Indian rupee as a potential alternative.
Since we are the most populous country now in the world, it's good for Uday to say, well, why can't we also be a reserve currency? But to my mind, I mean, we have a 2% share in world trade. We are a large population, but we're not a very large economy yet. So I think to think that we would become a reserve currency or even claim to become a reserve currency is a bit unnecessary, okay? The critical thing is, in order to become a reserve currency, you should be willing to say that we are opening up the capital account. I think if India were to do that, I mean, there'd be many, many changes that would occur. But I think if somebody were to ask Uday, are you recommending that we move to an open capital account, or do you think we can become a reserve currency without moving to an open capital account? That would take the discussion a little further. I don't know what his view would be, but my view is that if he can't move to an open capital account, then it's unrealistic to talk of being a reserve currency. I don't think it's particularly important also. I mean, we need a currency system that works where we can transact. And we should get on with becoming a bigger economy, more trade and all those kinds of things, which would automatically give us a larger position in the world.
The long and short of it is that for now, there is no alternative to the US dollar.
In the short run, I think that's correct. I mean, if you take the totality of what is necessary, the United States is the only country that's in a position to offer a package which meets all the requirements. Their biggest danger is if they disrupt their own dominance by taking unreasonable steps that will make people feel that, look, things are not as certain as we thought they were. But even if they did that, I mean, exactly what they can do about it is not too well known. That's why I feel this is something which should be put on the international agenda, not in a negotiating way, because quite honestly, governments don't know what they want. I think governments should say, look, there's a problem. And we should open this up for discussion so that people can kind of consider different ways of solving the problem. Now, that's not easy to do in the present situation where multilateralism is so fragmented. I mean, the G20 consists of the G7, the G2, which is Russia and China, a few other large developing countries, and a few others. Now, for all of them to have the same view is going to be difficult.
It is then clear that while the world may resent the hegemony of the US dollar, there's precious little it can do about it. However, given the growing tendency of the US to weaponize the power of the dollar, there is an immediate need to ring-fence the scope of these actions. As Montek points out, it is time for an honest conversation among nations. It will do good for all. After all, a stable world order will only grow the global economic pie. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and insights with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.